The courtroom froze the moment the lawyer stood up, closed his briefcase, and said the words no one expected. "I withdraw from this case, Your Honor." Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters jolted upright. Even the judge's gavel hung mid-air. At the defense table, the Mafia boss, Adrian Moretti, didn't move. For the first time in his life, the man feared by half the city looked alone. His enemies smiled. This was exactly what they wanted. Adrian cornered, defenseless, moments away from being crushed. The judge turned. "Mr. Moretti, you now have no legal representation. Do you have anyone prepared to defend you?" Silence. Then the courtroom doors burst open. A woman sprinted down the aisle, breathless, still wearing her faded Maid uniform, hands shaking but eyes burning with something fierce. "Wait!" she cried. "Please, don't continue!" Everyone stared. It was the boss's maid. The woman who cleaned his floors, carried his laundry, and lived in total silence at the edges of his world. The judge frowned. "And who are you?" She swallowed hard, then stepped beside Adrian like she had been standing there all her life. "My name is Elena, and I will defend him." Laughter erupted. Some mocked. Some whispered she had lost her mind. Even Adrian looked at her in shock. But Elena didn't flinch. "I know the truth," she said quietly. "I saw what everyone else missed. And if you give me 5 minutes, I can prove he's innocent." Suddenly, the room wasn't laughing anymore, because tucked inside her trembling hands was a piece of evidence that would shatter the entire case, something the lawyer never bothered to look for. And by the time she placed it on the judge's bench, everyone realized the one person the Mafia boss underestimated was the only one willing to fight for him. Stay with me until the end, because what Elena reveals next in that courtroom will turn the entire trial upside down and expose the betrayal that nearly destroyed the Mafia boss. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. 2 hours earlier, Elena Rodriguez had been scrubbing bloodstains from marble floors in the Moretti mansion. The same floors she'd cleaned every morning for 3 years. The same mansion where she'd learned to move like a ghost, invisible to everyone except the man who paid her wages. She never spoke unless spoken to, never asked questions, never looked too closely at the men in expensive suits who visited late at night. That was the deal when she took this job. Silence in exchange for enough money to send home to her sick mother in Guatemala. But this morning was different. This morning, Elena had overheard something that made her blood run cold. She was dusting the bookshelves in Adrian's study when his phone rang. The conversation was brief, harsh, and filled with words that didn't make sense until she pieced them together later. "The job is done," a voice said through the speaker. "Morrison took the money. He'll withdraw right before the trial starts." Elena's hand froze on the leather-bound book she was holding. Morrison, that was Adrian's lawyer, the same lawyer who'd been preparing his defense for months. And the evidence? Adrian's voice was low, dangerous, buried. "The prosecutor will never find it. Your boss will go down for murder, and we'll finally have what we want." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She shouldn't be hearing this. She should leave, pretend she never heard anything, go back to her small room and mind her own business. But something in Adrian's voice stopped her. It wasn't the voice of a guilty man. It was the voice of someone who knew he was being hunted by wolves. "How much did they pay Morrison?" Adrian asked. $2 million. More than enough to disappear after he ruins your case." The line went dead. Elena stood there, dust cloth trembling in her hands, as the pieces fell into place. Adrian wasn't just facing a murder charge. He was being framed. His own lawyer had been bought. The evidence that could save him had been hidden. And in 6 hours, he would walk into that courtroom completely defenseless. Elena had seen enough crime dramas to know what happened to men like Adrian when the system turned against them. They disappeared into maximum security prisons and never came out. Their empires crumbled. Their families were left with nothing. But Adrian had been different with her. Not kind exactly. Kindness wasn't in his vocabulary, but fair. He paid her well, on time, every week. When her mother needed emergency surgery last year, he'd advanced her 6-month salary without being asked. When other staff members were caught stealing, he fired them. When Elena accidentally broke a priceless vase, he'd simply told her to be more careful. He treated her like a human being. In her world, that was rare. So when Elena heard the prosecutor's opening statement on the courtroom radio that morning, painting Adrian as a cold-blooded killer who'd executed a rival gang member in broad daylight, she knew it was a lie. Not because Adrian was incapable of violence. She'd seen the scars on his hands, heard the whispered conversations about territory wars and blood debts, but because she'd been cleaning his study the night of the supposed murder. She'd seen him pacing the floor at midnight, phone pressed to his ear, desperately trying to prevent a war between the families. She'd heard him order his men to stand down, to find a peaceful solution. She'd watched him throw his phone against the wall in frustration when the negotiations failed. Adrian Moretti was many things, but he wasn't a murderer, at least not that night. And now, as Elena raced through the courthouse halls, her maid's uniform drawing stares and whispers, she clutched the one piece of evidence that could prove it. Security footage from the mansion's cameras, footage that showed exactly where Adrian was during the time of the murder, and it wasn't anywhere near the crime scene. She'd found it buried in the digital archives, misfiled under the wrong date. Morrison had been looking for it for weeks, claiming the system was corrupted. But Elena knew computers. She'd taught herself programming during long nights when insomnia kept her awake, learning skills that her education back home never provided. The footage was crystal clear. Adrian in his study from 11:30 until 2 in the morning. The murder had happened at midnight, 15 miles away. But when she'd tried to show Morrison earlier that morning, she'd been turned away. "The lawyer is unavailable," his secretary had said coldly. "He's preparing for court." Elena had waited outside his office for hours, growing more desperate as the clock ticked toward the trial. When Morrison finally emerged, she'd approached him with the evidence, explaining what she'd found. His reaction had been immediate and terrifying. He'd grabbed her arm, pulled her into an empty hallway, and spoken in a voice that made her skin crawl. "Listen carefully," he'd whispered. "You never found that footage. You never saw anything. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, you'll disappear just like the others who got too curious about Mr. Moretti's business." Then he'd deleted the file from her flash drive and walked away, leaving Elena shaking in the corridor. But Morrison had made one mistake. Elena had made copies, multiple copies, hidden in places he'd never think to look. Now, as the courtroom doors slammed behind her, and every eye in the room fixed on her trembling form, Elena realized she was about to gamble everything on a man who barely knew her name. Adrian stared at her like she'd lost her mind. The judge looked irritated. The prosecutor smirked, clearly viewing this as a desperate publicity stunt. But Elena had spent 3 years watching powerful men destroy each other with lies and manipulation. She'd seen how the system worked when money and influence corrupted everything it touched. Today, for the first time in her life, she was going to fight back. The first time in her life, she was going to fight back. The judge's gavel cracked against the bench like a gunshot. "Order! Order in this courtroom!" But the chaos only grew louder. Reporters shouted questions. Spectators craned their necks to get a better look at the maid who'd just claimed she could save the most dangerous man in the city. District Attorney Catherine Wells stood up, her perfectly pressed suit and calculated smile radiating confidence. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate publicity stunt." "Ms." She paused, looking Elena up and down with barely concealed disgust. "I'm sorry. I don't even know this person's name." "Rodriguez," Elena said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "Elena Rodriguez." Wells laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Ms. Rodriguez has no legal training, no understanding of courtroom procedure, and frankly, no business being here. I move to have her removed immediately." The judge, Harold Blackwood, was a man who'd seen everything in 30 years on the bench. Gang wars, corporate scandals, political corruption. Nothing surprised him anymore. But this? A maid claiming she could defend the city's most notorious crime boss? This was new. Ms. Rodriguez, Judge Blackwood said slowly, do you understand what you're asking? This is a murder trial. The defendant is facing life in prison. Are you telling this court that you, with no legal background, can mount an adequate defense? Elena's knees felt like water, but she forced herself to stand straighter. Every face in the courtroom was staring at her, some amused, some angry, some just curious to see how spectacularly she would fail. Your Honor, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. I may not have a law degree, but I have something else. I have the truth, and I have evidence that proves Mr. Moretti was nowhere near the scene when Vincent Castellano was murdered. The room erupted again. Vincent Castellano's murder had dominated headlines for months. The heir to a rival crime family, gunned down outside his restaurant in what prosecutors claimed was Adrian's attempt to start a war between the families. Judge Blackwood raised his hand for silence. Evidence? What evidence? Elena reached into the pocket of her uniform with trembling fingers and pulled out a small flash drive. Security footage from the Moretti mansion. Footage that shows exactly where Mr. Moretti was on the night of March 15th, between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. District Attorney Wells shot to her feet. Objection! This alleged evidence hasn't been authenticated, hasn't gone through proper discovery procedures, because it was deliberately hidden, Elena interrupted, her voice growing stronger. Hidden by people who wanted to make sure Mr. Moretti never had a chance to defend himself. The courtroom fell silent. Even the reporters stopped typing. Adrian finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. Elena, what are you doing? You don't understand what you're getting yourself into. She turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time since she'd burst through those doors. The man who commanded respect through fear, who could end lives with a phone call, who had built an empire on the streets of the city. Right now, he looked like what he was, a man facing the destruction of everything he'd built. I understand perfectly, Mr. Moretti, she said quietly. I understand that innocent people go to prison when the system is corrupted by money and lies. I understand that sometimes the only person willing to fight for the truth is someone who has nothing left to lose. Judge Blackwood studied Elena for a long moment. In all his years on the bench, he'd learned to read people. Lawyers lied professionally. Witnesses lied to save themselves. But this woman, standing there in her faded uniform, clutching evidence that could change everything, she was telling the truth. Ms. Rodriguez, he said finally, the court appreciates your dedication, but representing a defendant in a murder trial requires specific qualifications that you simply don't possess. Elena's heart sank. She'd come this far, risked everything, only to be turned away by bureaucracy. But then Adrian stood up. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded loyalty and fear for decades. I waive my right to qualified counsel. I choose to represent myself, with Ms. Rodriguez as my consultant. The judge's eyebrows shot up. Mr. Moretti, that is extremely inadvisable. You're facing life in prison. The prosecution has a strong case. The prosecution has a bought case. Adrian said flatly. My lawyer was paid $2 million to throw this trial. If I'm going down, I'd rather go down fighting alongside someone I trust than be betrayed by someone I'm paying. The words hit the courtroom like a bomb. Wells turned pale. The defense table, where Morrison had been sitting just an hour earlier, suddenly looked very empty and very suspicious. Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair. This was unprecedented, highly irregular. Probably a disaster waiting to happen. But technically, legally, a defendant had the right to represent himself, and if he wanted to bring an untrained consultant along for the ride. Very well, he said finally. Mr. Moretti, you may represent yourself. Ms. Rodriguez may assist as a consultant, but she may not address the court directly without your permission. And I'm warning both of you, This court will not tolerate any disruptions or theatrical displays. This is still a murder trial, not a television drama. Elena felt her legs nearly give out from relief. She'd done it. Somehow, impossibly, she'd convinced the judge to let her stay. But as she took her seat at the defense table next to Adrian, the reality of what she'd just committed to hit her like a truck. She was about to help defend a man accused of murder. She was going up against trained prosecutors with unlimited resources and years of experience, and she was armed with nothing but a flash drive and the absolute certainty that Adrian Moretti was innocent of this particular crime. "Elena," Adrian whispered as the judge called for a brief recess, "you have no idea what you've just gotten yourself into. These people don't just destroy careers, they destroy lives. You still have time to walk away." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Moretti, 3 years ago you gave me a job when no one else would. You paid for my mother's surgery when you didn't have to. You treated me like a human being when everyone else treated me like furniture. Now it's my turn to help you." Adrian stared at her for a moment, something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. "You realize that if we lose this, you won't just be out of a job. Wells and whoever is backing this frame job, they'll come after you. They'll make sure you disappear." Elena's smile was small but determined. "Then we better not lose." As the courtroom began to empty for the recess, Elena opened her laptop, a cheap model she'd bought with her savings, and began pulling up files. She had security footage, but that was just the beginning. During her 3 years in the Moretti mansion, she'd seen things, heard conversations, noticed patterns that no one else had paid attention to. Because that was the thing about being invisible. People said and did things around you that they never would if they remembered you were there. And Elena Rodriguez had been remembering everything. Now, as Elena stared at her laptop screen in the empty courtroom during recess, her mind raced through everything she'd witnessed over the past 3 years. The conversations she'd overheard while dusting furniture, the phone calls that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. The faces of men who visited the mansion at strange hours, always leaving with expressions she couldn't quite read. But there was something else, something that had been nagging at her since the moment she'd heard about Vincent Castellano's murder, a detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt like the missing piece of a deadly puzzle. She pulled up another file on her laptop, this one containing records she'd meticulously kept over the years. Not because she was spying, but because Adrian had asked her to maintain a log of all visitors to the mansion. "Security purposes," he'd said. Elena had been thorough, noting dates, times, and the business cards she collected from the foyer table after meetings ended. Her finger traced down the screen until she found what she was looking for. March 13th, 2 days before the murder. A visitor she'd never seen before or since. The business card he'd left behind read, "Marcus Webb, private investigator." Elena's heart began to pound. She remembered that meeting clearly now because it had been different from the others. Adrian had been agitated afterward, pacing his study until nearly dawn. She'd heard him making phone calls, his voice urgent, almost panicked. But what really caught her attention was what she'd found the next morning while cleaning his office. A torn photograph, half burned in the fireplace. She'd almost thrown it away, but something made her pocket it instead. Now, as she pulled the singed fragment from her purse, the pieces began falling into place. The photograph showed Vincent Castellano, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a woman Elena recognized from society pages, Margaret Castellano, Vincent's wife. And in the background, barely visible but unmistakably clear to someone who'd memorized every face that entered the Moretti mansion, was Marcus Webb. Elena's hands trembled as she pulled up internet search results on her phone. Marcus Webb's website was professional, sleek, specializing in matrimonial investigations, divorce cases, cheating spouses, the kind of work that destroyed families and sometimes got people killed. The recess was ending, but Elena's mind was spinning faster than ever. If Vincent Castellano had hired a private investigator to follow his wife, and if that investigation had led to the Moretti mansion, then this wasn't about gang territory at all. This was about something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. She thought about Margaret Castellano, a woman she'd seen exactly once at a charity event covered in the local papers. Beautiful, sophisticated, married to one of the most powerful men in the city's underworld. But what if she'd been living a double life? What if she'd been meeting someone at the Moretti mansion? Not Adrian himself, but someone in his organization. Elena's breath caught in her throat as another memory surfaced. 3 weeks before the murder, she'd been cleaning the guest house when a black sedan had pulled up to the mansion's side entrance. A woman had gotten out, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat and oversized sunglasses. Elena had thought nothing of it at the time. Adrian conducted business with all kinds of people, but now, studying the photograph again, she realized the woman's build, her elegant posture, even the way she carried her purse, matched Margaret Castellano perfectly. The courtroom doors opened, and people began filing back in. Elena quickly saved her files and closed the laptop, but her mind continued racing. If Margaret Castellano had been having an affair with someone connected to Adrian's organization, and if her husband had discovered it through Marcus Webb's investigation, then Vincent's murder might not have been about gang warfare at all. It might have been about a husband's rage and a cover-up that went deeper than anyone imagined. Adrian returned to the defense table, his expression grim. The weight of the situation was clearly pressing down on him, but when he saw Elena's face, something shifted in his demeanor. "You found something," he said quietly, settling into his chair. "Maybe," Elena whispered back. "But it's not what anyone expects." District Attorney Wells approached the prosecution table with renewed confidence, clearly believing that the recess had given her time to prepare for whatever amateur defense Elena might attempt. She had no idea that everything she thought she knew about this case was about to crumble. Judge Blackwood returned to the bench, his robes rustling as he settled into position. "Court is now back in session. Ms. Wells, you may continue with your opening statement." Wells stood, her smile sharp as a blade. "Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about power, territory, and the cold-blooded murder of Vincent Castellano by a man who believed he could eliminate his competition with bullets rather than business." She walked slowly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each member. "The evidence will show that Adrian Moretti orchestrated this killing as part of a larger plan to control the city's underground economy. Vincent Castellano was a threat to that control, so he was eliminated. Simple, brutal, effective." Elena watched the jurors' faces as Wells painted her picture of Adrian as a calculating killer. Some nodded along, already convinced. Others looked skeptical but attentive. All of them seemed to accept the basic premise that this was a straightforward gang execution. None of them suspected that the real motive for Vincent Castellano's death had nothing to do with territory or business deals, and everything to do with a marriage falling apart in the shadows of the city's most dangerous families. Wells continued her opening statement for another 20 minutes, methodically laying out a timeline that placed Adrian at the scene of the crime, presenting phone records that allegedly showed him coordinating with his associates, and promising witness testimony that would seal his fate. When she finally returned to her seat, the silence in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew that Adrian had chosen to represent himself with only a maid as his consultant. The smart money was on this being a very short trial. Judge Blackwood looked toward the defense table. "Mr. Moretti, you may present your opening statement." Adrian stood slowly, and for a moment, Elena saw him as she imagined others did. Tall, imposing, with the kind of presence that commanded attention even in a courtroom designed to diminish defendants. But she also saw something else. A man who'd spent his entire life building walls around himself, only to find that those same walls had become a prison when the people he trusted most betrayed him. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Adrian began, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I stand before you today, not as the monster the prosecution wants you to see, but as a man who has been framed by people willing to destroy lives to protect their own secrets." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The prosecution wants you to believe this is a simple case of gang violence. They want you to accept that Vincent Castellano died because of territory disputes and criminal ambition. But the truth is far more complicated and far more personal than anyone in this room imagines." Elena felt her heart racing as Adrian continued, his opening statement setting the stage for revelations that would shock everyone present. "Over the next few days, we will present evidence that proves I was nowhere near the scene of Vincent Castellano's murder. We will show you that the real motive for his death had nothing to do with criminal enterprise and everything to do with a betrayal that reaches into the highest levels of this city's elite." Wells started to stand, probably to object, but Adrian held up his hand. "We will prove that Vincent Castellano was killed, not by a rival gang leader, but by people who discovered his wife's secret affair and decided that murder was preferable to scandal. And we will show you that my former attorney was paid handsomely to ensure that this truth never saw the light of day." The courtroom erupted. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. The jury members looked stunned. Even Judge Blackwood seemed taken aback by the direction Adrian's defense was taking. But Elena was watching Margaret Castellano, who had been sitting in the front row throughout the proceedings. The color had drained completely from her face, and her hands were gripping her purse so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. For the first time since this nightmare began, Elena allowed herself to hope, because sometimes the truth was stranger than any fiction, and sometimes a maid who paid attention to details everyone else ignored was exactly what an innocent man needed to save his life. His life. Margaret Castellano's reaction hadn't gone unnoticed. Detective Ray Morrison, no relation to the corrupt lawyer, sat in the back row, his trained eyes catching every micro-expression that crossed her face during Adrian's opening statement. He'd been investigating Vincent's murder independently, always suspicious that the official narrative felt too convenient, too clean. Now, watching Margaret's composure crack in real time, pieces of his own investigation suddenly clicked into place. The unexplained financial transfers from her personal account. The burner phone found in her car during the initial investigation, dismissed as irrelevant. The witness who claimed to see a woman leaving the scene but was never called to testify. Elena caught Detective Morrison's eye across the courtroom. Something in his expression told her he was thinking along the same lines she was. They had an ally they didn't even know about. Judge Blackwood called for another brief recess to allow the prosecution time to review Adrian's unexpected defense strategy. As the courtroom emptied, Elena noticed Margaret Castellano rushing toward the exit, her phone already pressed to her ear. "We need to follow her," Elena whispered to Adrian. He shook his head. "Elena, you've done enough. This is dangerous territory now. If Margaret was involved in her husband's death, she has powerful people protecting her, people who won't hesitate to eliminate threats." But Detective Morrison appeared at their table before Elena could respond. "Mr. Moretti, Ms. Rodriguez, I think we need to talk. I'm Detective Morrison, and I've been working this case from a different angle." Adrian's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Another cop trying to build his career on my conviction?" "No," Morrison said firmly. "A cop who's been asking why Vincent Castellano's murder was solved so quickly, and why certain evidence disappeared from the crime scene before I could examine it properly." Elena leaned forward. "What kind of evidence?" Morrison glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Security footage from the restaurant across the street. The owner told me it clearly showed the killer's face. But when I went to collect it 3 days later, the system had mysteriously malfunctioned and wiped everything." "How convenient," Adrian muttered. "That's what I thought. Then I started digging into who might have had access to that security system. Turns out, Margaret Castellano's brother owns a private security company that services half the businesses in that district." Elena felt the pieces clicking together faster now. She had the footage destroyed to protect someone, Or to protect herself, Morrison added. I've been tracking her movements the night of the murder. Her alibi has more holes than Swiss cheese, but every time I try to investigate further, I get calls from downtown telling me to focus on building the case against Mr. Moretti. The courtroom began filling again as the recess ended. Morrison handed Elena a small card. My personal number. Whatever evidence you're planning to present, make sure you have copies hidden somewhere safe. People are watching this trial very carefully. As they returned to their seats, Elena noticed that Margaret Castellano hadn't come back. Her front row seat remained conspicuously empty for the rest of the afternoon. Judge Blackwood called for the prosecution to present their first witness. Wells stood confidently, clearly believing that Adrian's opening statement was nothing more than desperate theater. The prosecution calls Detective Frank Sullivan to the stand. Sullivan was a 20-year veteran of the force, gray-haired and steady. He'd been the lead investigator on Vincent's murder case and had built what appeared to be an airtight case against Adrian. Wells walked him through the standard procedure: the crime scene, the evidence collected, the timeline that placed Adrian in the area during the murder. Sullivan's testimony was professional, thorough, and damning, but Elena was watching his body language, noticing things that years of observing people had taught her to see. When Wells asked about the security footage from nearby businesses, Sullivan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. When she mentioned witness statements, his eyes flickered toward the empty seat where Margaret should have been sitting. When it came time for cross-examination, Adrian stood slowly. He wasn't a trained lawyer, but he'd spent decades reading people, understanding their motivations and weaknesses. Detective Sullivan, Adrian began, in your 20 years of police work, how many murder cases have you solved this quickly? Sullivan shifted slightly. Every case is different, Mr. Moretti. Sometimes the evidence points clearly to a suspect. Indeed. And in this case, the evidence pointed to me within 48 hours of the murder. Remarkably efficient police work. Wells started to object, but Adrian continued. Detective, did you investigate any other potential suspects? We followed all leads. Did those leads include Vincent Castellano's personal life? His marriage? His business relationships outside of alleged gang activities? Sullivan's pause was telling. We investigated all relevant angles. Adrian walked closer to the witness stand. Did you interview Mrs. Margaret Castellano about her whereabouts on the night of the murder? Of course. She was at home, grieving the loss of her husband. Did you verify that alibi independently? Another pause. Mrs. Castellano was the victim's widow. There was no reason to suspect. That's not what I asked, Detective. Did you verify her alibi independently? Sullivan's composure cracked slightly. She had no motive to harm her husband. Elena watched the jury carefully. Several members were leaning forward now, clearly intrigued by this line of questioning. The prosecution's case was starting to look less airtight and more selective. Elena's story proves that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the shadows when justice hangs in the balance. A maid with nothing but courage and the truth became the one person willing to stand against corruption and betrayal. Her loyalty and sharp eye for detail saved an innocent man from a life sentence, exposing a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. What would you do if you witnessed an injustice that everyone else ignored? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things.